Hello, and welcome to Homegrown History with Limestone County archivist Rebekah Davis and longtime Athens, Alabama native Richard Martin. Each episode, Richard and Rebekah bring to life some of the famous and infamous stories etched in Limestone County's rich history.
Hello and welcome to the Homegrown History Podcast, your Limestone County History Podcast. I'm Rebekah Davis. I'm the archivist at the Limestone County Archives in Athens, Alabama, along with my fellow co-host.
I'm Richard Martin, the oldest one here. I'm 81. Glad to be here.
That's right. We're glad to have you here. And you hear that cute little giggle? That is our friend, Kelly Kazek. We are very honored to have Kelly as our guest today. Kelly and I have been friends for a minute and a half, ever since she was my boss at the News Courier. She's now with AL.com, and she is the one who wrote the book, or at least one of them, on Limestone County tornadoes and Alabama's deadly tornadoes. And we're just glad to have you here today because our topic of the day is going to be tornadoes in Limestone County. Everybody's got a tornado story, but we're going to go with Kelly's tornado stories today.
Everybody does have a tornado story. Thank you for having me. It's not a fun topic, but It is fun to get to share some history with folks. The tornadoes have always fascinated me, and I did write one book for the News Courier after the 2011 tornadoes, and then I wrote one called A History of Alabama's Deadliest Tornadoes that goes from 1908 to 1998. So
that's right.
I've got a lot of information.
That's right. And if you don't have a copy of those books, we do have those at the Limestone County Archives, as well as a book from 1974, April 3rd, 1974, A Night to Remember, because that was the big super outbreak that everybody thought was going to be the deadliest and the worst ever, which it was the deadliest in Limestone County. Although 2011, as far as destruction, ended up rivaling 1974, didn't it?
It did. It still is the most fatalities, 74, but 2011 had stronger tornadoes and more damage and was on the ground a lot longer.
Right.
And interestingly, they followed the same path for a little ways.
So let's kind of start at the beginning. Now, one of the things that Kelly and I have worked together with, as well as several other people in this community, is the Tornado Memorial that is now out near where Bethel Church of Christ used to be before it got blown away. One of how many times has Bethel gotten blown away out on 72?
Well, this one was really blown away. April 27, 2011, it was destroyed. But their cemetery is just a little ways away on Highway 72, and we thought that would be perfect for the Tornado Memorial, and they were kind enough to give us permission to put it there.
Right. So back in 2011 to 2012, Kelly and I and a group of community volunteers joined the Tornado Remembrance and Awareness Committee and help make that happen. You can go out there and see a little bit about what we're going to talk about today, which is the names of all the people that have been known to have died in Limestone County tornadoes that we have on the historic record anyway. And unfortunately, there are blank slates because we keep adding them every few springs when tornadoes come through. And the first tornado that I know of that we have on the record in Limestone County, as far as deaths in Limestone County, was in 1913 when 3 people in Tanner died. But cyclones, as they were called in the historic record, have been part of Limestone County history since long before we came here and long after we'll blow away, haven't they?
Well, I'll tell you a little background on that. You know, the National Weather Service official statistics begin in 1950. So any tornadoes before that, before they had the Fujita scale, the meteorologists went back and looked up old newspaper records, and they would judge the damage and the deaths from newspaper records. And they would then rate the tornadoes. You know, some from 1800s, they were rating them, but they were just basing them on what information they had because they didn't go out then and do the research they do now on a tornado. Anyway, so yes, 1913, and we have some from 1920 because we had some good newspaper records, but I'm sure they've been going on since long before that.
I know. In 24, an entire family of Collinses all died in Limestone County in one hit.
Yes, and that's a crazy one because it's one of those that's so fascinating as how tornadoes work. There is a grave at Antioch Cemetery in Elkmont where all the 8 members of the Collins family are buried, the parents and the 6 children.
Wow.
They were all at home on their farm in Elkmont when a tornado came through in the middle of the night. Well, in 1924, they didn't have, this was May 26, 1924, they didn't have the warnings, they didn't have a TV, they didn't have anything they could get news from, so they didn't know anything was coming, and there had been nothing earlier in the day to suggest it.
Yeah.
The next morning, the nephew of the Collinses lived a ways away because it's in the country, but they could see the house. They came outside and there was no house there.
Crazy.
So they went over there and they found several buildings destroyed in the house. All the livestock was still alive. The chickens had all their feathers gone, and there were no bodies there. They had to go and do search and find all the bodies out in the fields. And they buried them. The parents had 2 black coffins, and the little 2 boys had gray, and the little girls had white.
Oh.
And they buried them all together there.
Now, what part of the county was that?
Elkmont.
Up in Elkmont?
And what's really weird about that is there was a family of 8 killed in Walker County.
Oh, wow.
By a different tornado that night.
Those random tornadoes that just boom down and hit and go,
Right.
It almost just feels like wrath of God type stuff, especially when you talk about these massive, F4, F5.
Right.
I
mean, nobody else knew it was
tornadoes.
there. That one they ended up rating in 24 and F3. But nobody else knew it was there. It's like it just dropped out and hit that farm and went.
Right.
It's really
That is wild.
bizarre things.
What do you remember, Richard, from growing up in Limestone County?
From 1924, Richard.
I know you don't remember 1924, but you might remember before 1950.
Well, I didn't pay any attention to them. We didn't have the warnings or anything. We just thought it was a windstorm. So we never paid any attention to them. A little boy like me didn't care. Only one that really affected me so much was the one in 1974 that you've done a story on, haven't you?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
And I said before that there'll be stories coming from that tornado long after we're gone that we've never heard before.
And just wild stuff, too. What do you remember, Richard, from that night?
Well, I remember I was at Lake Ida. It's a restaurant on Nick Davis Road and Lindsay Lane, and we were sitting there eating, and this huge chunk of ice, bigger than a football, fell right in front of us. And we looked at, oh my gosh, that's hail. And we knew something was going on, so we ran home, in the car. And then, of course, we turned on the radio, and then, bam, there it all was.
Right.
The big 74 tornado. It was just awful.
What community did you live in at that time?
I lived out in East Hampton subdivision out there off of Lindsay Lane at the time.
It didn't hit you.
It didn't hit me, but it hit the Isom's.
Right.
Isom's Orchard and all up in through there. But the other thing I remember that impressed me about it is the next day, everybody was just stunned. And then the next day, they asked people to come and who wanted to help. And they all came down to the Civil Defense Office, and there were hundreds. And we went out into cotton fields and cleaned up the cotton fields, and L&S gave us bread and peanut butter jelly and bologna to make sandwiches. And the whole community, there had to be 200 to 300 people that day want to help out and clean up something that nothing happened to them.
Well, and my mama tells me about people coming down from, Amish coming down to help rebuild.
Right.
From Pennsylvania.
We had a lot of that. A lot of that.
Well, interestingly, though, that night there were 2 really strong. They initially rated an F4 and an F5, but then they went back and called them both F5s. But they came within half an hour on the same path. There were people who were hit and were just now standing up and saying, oh, we survived, and here it comes again.
Buddy Evans, the sheriff, was one of those. He got in the ditch twice. Had to throw his clothes away. Couldn't get the red clay out of them.
Right.
That's right. Well, and it's interesting, you said tornadoes weren't a big deal for you. Well, you grew up in town in Athens.
Right.
And typically, until 2014, when it hit my old neighborhood, tornadoes didn't come through town in Athens. Didn't come through Northtown until 2014, that tornado. But there's that one track. And now I've heard, I don't know if this is true, but part of that has to do with the lay of the land here in Limestone County that sort of funnels tornadoes down by the river through Tanner area. That's why they keep taking the same track, and then up through the mountains. But you do see that there's, what's it called? I think it's called Dixie Alley. Tell us what you know about that.
All of the South is Dixie Alley because, everybody's accustomed to growing up thinking the plains, Kansas, Oklahoma, those are tornadoes. That's where Dorothy was. Right. But we know here that they occur here just as much. We've had more F5s here in Alabama. We did have more than any other state after 2011. Now I think we were back to second or third because
it's a dubious distinction.
I know it's an awful thing to have, but the trail through here runs from down in Tanner through, goes up to the county line near the prison,
right
near Love Branch Road. In 2011, it did hit the prison. So.
Right, exactly. Well, and some of the same houses that were hit in 74 got hit in 2011. I wanted to go ahead and start talking a little bit about the 74 tornadoes and come to that because, it was a Wednesday night. A lot of folks were headed to church. Some people were saved because they were at church. In more ways than one, right? As opposed to being in their houses that got blown away. But then there were churches that got hit too.
Right.
In 74 and in 2011. And I remember my mom said, people thought tornadoes were turning around and coming back because they kept getting hit. And, you mentioned out in the plains, you think of the classic, you see the big funnel drop out of the sky and you can see it for miles around. But in here, they'd usually come at night and they're wrapped in the rain.
And they're rain
and it just looks like a long cloud.
Mm-hmm.
I know. So Sandra Birdwell was the assistant archivist at the Limestone County Archives for 16 years. And her story is in this 1974 book.
And in my book.
Yes, it's in your book. So let's talk about Sandra. We'll start with her. I mean, there's no lack of stories. And I almost hate to start telling any one story because we're going to get all these people complaining that their story didn't get told on the podcast. But Sandra, her husband was at work. She was at home with her 2 little boys. And, she knew it was getting, stormy. She saw a cloud out that way, but it just looked like a big thundercloud. But then she realized it wasn't thundering, and it got real quiet. And her boys, Neil and Jeff, a lot of people would get in the fireplace. That was the sturdiest part of their house. They got up under the fireplace, and as a mama, this hurts my mama heart every time I think about it. She's trying to hang on to them, and the tornado hits, and the winds pull her out away from her babies,
right,
and flattened her house. And when it all passed, she found her son Neil. She said he was like in a little cave of bricks. He was okay, but Jeff was nowhere to be found. And she went looking for him and found him out in the field across the street up next to a telephone pole. He'd picked up and dropped him out there. Yeah. And he was okay. Miraculously, but they went to the hospital with, cuts and bruises and stuff. And while they were gone, their husband, Larry, came to find her, went looking at the church, went looking at her mama's house, couldn't find her anywhere, came to the house. That whole, stack of bricks and everything that had been there that Neil was in, it was gone. And a tornado hit again.
The second tornado.
And, they moved elsewhere after that. And in 2011, the house that was built on that same spot flattened.
Yeah. I will say, before we go into the same houses being hit, I will say that Walter McLaughlin's children were killed from being in a fireplace.
Yes.
They were killed by the fireplace.
Tell about Walter McLaughlin and his family. And Walter McLaughlin, he was a Limestone County commissioner in the Clements area for years. And I think at that time he was working with the county commission.
Or he was working with the city of Athens Utilities.
Tell us about it, Richard.
I knew Walter and his family, and he was working for the Athens Utility.
Right.
It was his son's birthday.
Yeah,
they were having
2 years old.
They were going to have a birthday party. But Walter had been called out because a line went down, and he was called out to repair it. So he had to leave his family at home, and the house was hit.
That's right. And there were 7 people in that house, his wife and 3 or 4 of their kids, his nephew that was there. And when he came home, the house was gone. And they had to that was another situation where they had to find their family members. His wife and their child all were hit and killed by that tornado at that time.
It was really tragic. Tornadoes don't, you're not ever safe. What I tell people is don't ever assume you're safe.
Right.
The only way you're safe is if you are underground somewhere.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Well, and farther back, we didn't have the tornado sirens. And that's one big thing that has made 2 big things that have made a difference in Limestone County survival rates is one, just the tornado sirens.
Right.
They were in place by 74, weren't they?
There were some sirens then, but they're not the same that we have now, and there weren't as many, of course. But also, a meteorologist will tell you don't rely on a siren because yours may not be working, or you're not ever supposed to rely on just one thing. You need to have your weather radio and
James Spann.
And James Spann.
There's a reason that James Spann is the greatest, largest celebrity in Alabama.
I know.
And the minute he takes off that jacket,
It's
if he rolls
serious.
up the sleeves, man, you better find your hole to hide in.
I know, really. I mean, it's for real, though. I mean, my daughter Shannon and I, after 2011, we take everything very seriously. Mm-hmm. That tornado passed a half mile behind our house. We had a tree down and some debris, but, obviously we were very lucky. But, she's terrified now. Mm-hmm. And you hear any kind of siren or any kind of weather alert, and we take cover.
That's right. Well, and, we were talking about houses getting hit more than once. My children's grandparents on their daddy's side, in 1974, they were living in Huntsville, renting a house, and their house got hit. They weren't there.
It hit Parkway City Mall.
That's
remember?
Right. That's right. And it, damaged their house. Well, skipping ahead to 2014 took a different track. It went through Clements and then through Northtown, at North Athens. And
you should explain a little. That was the really bad one that came and hit the trailer park and wiped it out and killed 2 people.
That's right. That's exactly right. Well, and listen, what it did with my in-laws at the time, they had a storm shelter beside their house. And at the last minute, they decided we're not going to try to get in that shelter. It was flooded a little bit, and they decided to get out. And they went to town to stay at their other son's house who had a basement. And when they came back, the tornado had hit their house, lifted the roof, and dropped it back down. So from the outside, it kind of looked okay. But then you go inside, and there's things like a piece of paper stuck between the ceiling and the wall, and the top of the wall, and things like that.
Do you know how many pictures I've taken like that? It's crazy.
And so, but it blew off all the bricks on the west side of their house where the storm shelter was, dropped them on top of the shelter, and the shelter flooded all the way to the ceiling. So if they had been in that shelter, they probably would have drowned. And as it was, they were able to make it out, but they had to rebuild. They lost their home in both of those tornadoes.
Wow.
Yeah. They barely got out of Hurricane Katrina, too. I think they must be part cat, 9 lives. I know that's one thing that there's been so many stories where you see a house where the entire front wall is gone, but the Bible is on the nightstand still open to Psalm 23 or whatever, What are some of the things that you have learned in your study of tornadoes and just some of the wild stuff that has happened?
Well, actually, and some of this may sound like I'm reading because I'm going to pull out this book and read a few. I have a chapter called Freaks of Nature.
Yes, please.
The Limestone Democrat, which was here in 1932, reported from the March super outbreak that many freakish pranks were played out by the winds. One person having a piece of wood blown through his leg.
Oh, God. That's painful.
And during that Dixie outbreak, a home in Columbiana in Alabama was destroyed, but the kitchen table still stood. And a drawer in the side of the table had been sucked out, but 36 eggs were unbroken on the top of the table.
Isn't that wild? Isn't that wild?
I mean, there's just crazy stuff. And then from 74, this is one of the stories that has been told and told and told. But in Huntsville, there was a woman who was... this is the 1989, November 15th, 1989, yes. Huntsville. Mm-hmm. And she was standing, she had made it to her door and put the key in the lock when it hit. Mm-hmm. So she turned and huddled to the door and just waited it out. Mm-hmm. And she survived. And when she stood back, there was an outline of her where all the debris had hit the door, but it was clean where she was standing. Yeah. And there were things, like embedded in the door. So she was wearing a London Fog coat. So London Fog sent her a new coat when they read the story.
Hey, there's an ad for London Fog right there, man.
But there are pictures of that outline being on the door. I mean, there's just crazy stuff that happens.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you see things, cars wrapped around telephone poles. And I remember reading about in 74, the metal door that got blown off the Birdwell's house was up in a tree and like a 2x4 embedded into a 2x6 without it even splintering. It just looked like it was carved out to be like that. Just things driven into trees. And
well, one of the things that was interesting, my daughter took a picture in the 2011 one. She had a friend who their car had a 2x4 through the window, which wouldn't seem so odd, except the 2x4 went through the window and then came back out the windshield and didn't break it. It was threaded through the windshield. And we have a picture of that too. So, just crazy stuff.
Right, exactly. Well, and I know one thing that's interesting to me is the EMA worked after the 2011 tornadoes and took aerial photos of the damage, and then plotted a map, of the destruction with the photos to correspond. And so you can clearly see where some of those same houses, and some of that same track was. And for some reason, it seems that it always wants to hit the Lawson's trailer. Well, it's not Lawson's Trailer Park anymore. But now it hit Lawson's really bad in 74, didn't it?
And it does make a difference. Mobile homes are more quickly swept away. And that is something you have to be careful. If you're in a mobile home, you do need to take cover for sure.
So what are some more stories that you have found that have just really piqued your interest about tornadoes here in Limestone County and in Alabama?
Well, in my book on Alabama's Deadliest tornadoes, I wrote about a 1998 outbreak that hit the Birmingham area, and it destroyed a couple of small communities there. And one of the people told me in his remembrances that they knew a tornado had come through because they could smell the pine, because it just snapped the trees. It just snapped a big row of trees, and you could smell the pine sap, and they knew it was a tornado coming through. And, in 1989 in Huntsville, I went down there. I was a cub reporter then, and I went down there, and, those huge metal utility poles,
Yes.
they were all bent at almost a 90-degree angle. They were just bent all the way up Airport Road. I mean, it was just freaky to look at.
I remember seeing that out in East Limestone and Tanner area after the 2011 tornadoes.
Here's a little tidbit for you.
Please do.
Athens Utilities had to replace 500 utility poles after 2011.
Wow, I believe it. And I feel like we cannot talk about this without giving a shout out to the utility workers.
Oh, yes, definitely.
After the tornadoes, they're the ones that come in from all over. And a lot of times while it's still storming and they're trying to get everything back on and going.
I agree completely. Let me tell you one of the weird ones about the Birmingham, the 1998. In Edgewater, a home was destroyed when it was pounded with bricks from the Methodist church next door. Only a part of the kitchen wall and a counter remained, yet none of the dishes on the counter were broken.
Crazy.
I mean, there's just all kinds of, you could go on and on. One that struck in Concord demolished a garage in the backyard of this woman's house and pulled up every shrub that had been planted beside it, but the car inside of the garage was untouched.
Wow.
So you just don't ever know what's going to happen. I mean,
so you should take them very seriously.
That's right.
For sure.
And I think we're better off now in a lot of ways to be able to have, the early warning system on TV now and the super, specific radar. But there are still times that one will come out of the blue that, that you weren't expecting.
Right.
So you have written extensively about the 2011 tornadoes. Tell us a little bit more about those specifically and some of the things you remember from the 2011 tornadoes.
Okay. I'm going to give you a few statistics, and then I'm going to tell you about what happened that day for me personally. But statistics are that statewide we had 62 tornadoes touch down. In Limestone County, we had 7. And we had EF5 tornadoes in Alabama that day. 2 hit, the one in Limestone County and the one in DeKalb County. Everybody remembers Tuscaloosa because it was so bad, and it was an F4, although I think they might have gone back and changed that rating to an F5. But everyone remembers that one.
Right.
Alabama has had 7 F5 tornadoes in its history.
And how many of those have been in Limestone County?
There have been several. We know that there were 3.
Wow.
We're
just special, aren't we?
Right. But on April 27, 2011, there were 202 tornadoes in 14 states.
Wow.
247 died in Alabama, 4 in Limestone County, and 9 in Madison County from that F5 that came through. So, yes, it was horrible. But I'll tell you that day, I was at home because I was on vacation, the perfect time to take a vacation.
Right. Tornado weather.
So I took a staycation. So I'm an editor, and, you always think something's going to happen when I'm not there. But I was at home, and I had been calling the office saying, we knew there was a storm coming and we have to get a paper out. You have to get a paper out no matter what happens.
Of course.
Well, my daughter wasn't home, and her boyfriend was trying to bring her home, and every road they hit was flooded. They couldn't get to the house. It was late when they finally got there, and she was terrified. But we, there's no power, so we lit a fire so we could see. I'll go back, though, on the day of the tornado, she had wanted to go to class at Calhoun. Mm-hmm. And I told her, no, you're not going to class. Right. Well, the tornado went through Calhoun.
Oh, wow.
That day. Because there were several coming through all day long.
Right.
And so every time one would stop, you'd get another warning. But anyway, the next morning we got up, Shannon and I, like 5:30, and I'd heard there'd been the 2 deaths in Limestone County. So we got out and started taking photos and trying to see what the damage was so we could report on it to people. And the first thing we saw near the prison was 3 cow carcasses. Yeah. And that's when we knew, and Shannon just teared up, and that's when we knew, this is going to be bad.
Yeah.
Really bad. And I spent the next several weeks, it was weeks of just doing nothing but going out in those areas, doing coverage, interviewing people, taking people food, just anything. We were out in it constantly for days. And you get really kind of weighed down by it. I mean, obviously not as much as the people who've been hit. I don't want to suggest that. But it's hard.
It is. It's overwhelming.
It is. It's to see that kind of damage.
What are some of the stories, maybe 1 or 2, that really stood out to you from that day, either from victims and survivors, but then also from the people, the helping hands?
Oh, it's great, the people who would come out. Shannon and I made peanut butter sandwiches and took them out for all the kids who were out there helping their parents go through the rubble. But there were people giving out free Chick-fil-A. There were people with coolers with water. I mean, there were people everywhere. And then there were Boy Scouts with chainsaws. I mean, it's amazing to see the people who will come help. And it's so good to know that's the case.
Well, I think when I look back at the history of tornadoes in Limestone County, that's one thing that hits me is that, number one, we always rebuild. We're just tough in this county. Limestone, man, that's what we're made out of.
You have to rebuild.
But also how everybody feels like you want to do something. You want to do something to help. If you made it through, even if all it is buying up some water and going around and handing out. That's what I did. I went and bought up cases of water, and I just drove down Huntsville Browns Ferry Road, and I'd stop and say, here's some water for a crew, and go down to the next one.
Right.
But,
because the crews have to eat too.
Yeah, exactly. And it brings the community together.
It does.
What were some of the stories of the people who had been hit, had lost things? What are some stories that really stood out to you of just the damage and loss?
Well, I know 2 people in Tanner were still living in the homes they rebuilt after 74.
Yeah.
They had rebuilt after 74 and were still living there, and both homes were demolished. And I can't recall the names right offhand, but one woman I know told her husband that she wanted to move, and so he built her a storm shelter. And they were in that storm shelter in 2011 when the tornado came through. So, I mean, there were just some terrible cases like that where people had lost everything again.
Right. Well, and one of the things that hits me too is big old trees. Is it the Gamble plantation that had so many trees?
They had those cedar trees.
Tell about that.
And they lost every one of them.
That's right.
I think there's one standing. That's out on the Huntsville Browns Ferry Road.
Right. I mean, it's like something straight out of a movie, you know, where the long driveway lined with cedars all the way down, and every one of them got taken out. I know my in-laws had about 100-year-old tree that was taken out in the 2014 tornadoes. And that's one thing, you can rebuild a home, but you can't just replant a 100-year-old tree, can you?
No, and some of those trees do damage, which you don't really think about, to cemeteries. I've seen some cemeteries be seriously damaged with all of the headstones broken. And, there are people who usually help with trying to get those replaced.
The Nick Davis Cemetery lost its monument.
Yes.
That's right.
And we had to put it back.
Yeah, right out there in East Limestone.
Well, that's something people don't think about. That's a nice thing to offer to help with. Donate money to redo the cemeteries, I remember after Katrina, I also went down to do some coverage after Katrina in Mississippi, and there were cemeteries where all the coffins had floated out.
Oh, yeah, Mississippi. Of course.
So, I mean, just all kinds of damage.
When you talk about the trees, I grew up off of North Hines Street, and had never been hit by a tornado. I mean, I had neighbors who had lived there for 70 years, and they said, I've never seen a tornado come through this part of town. And in 2014, it took a funky track and went straight through and tore up around Jackson Drive and 7th Avenue. And it didn't come all the way to the ground, but because there were so many old established trees, it hit the trees, which destroyed the houses.
Which
and
hit
it
the
looked
houses.
like an absolute bomb had gone off.
Yeah.
And it's my daughter's best friend's mama and them. They lived over on 7th Avenue. They were getting ready to put their house up for sale. Like, they had just listed it that day. And, buddy, she had cleaned that house. She had taken the, what am I trying to say? The dryer sheets, taking dryer sheets and wiped down the baseboards. Not a speck of dust in that house. And then the tornado came through that day, and they left to go to her mama's. And when they came back, they had a duplex.
Oh,
because
wow.
there was a tree down
Right
right
in the
middle of it. You know, and then they had to kind of haggle with the insurance company who wanted to say, it's not totaled. You can rebuild. And she's like, my house is in 2 pieces.
I'm going to tell you that is the case. You know, people spray painted signs after 2011 to show their sense of humor.
Oh, yeah.
People would say house for sale, assembly required, because their house was just a mess. And then there was, I remember one guy wrote that FEMA says he can move back in, and you looked at his house and you're like, nobody could live in that house.
Right, exactly.
You know, it's kind of crazy.
It turned out okay because finally the insurance company, you know, agreed. And so she didn't have to go through the process of selling the house. They were able to move. And actually,
there are still some houses out there from 2011 that are still just a rubble.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and one of the things I have found in going through our old photos, historic photos of the Limestone County Archives, there are some beautiful old homes, historic homes that are no longer with us because of tornadoes that have hit over the years. And it's, you know, it's just part of living in Limestone County and in the Tennessee Valley. It's, you know, you pick your poison, right? If you live out in California, you got earthquakes and
Fires.
and fires. And if you live in Florida, you got hurricanes. Well, here we got tornadoes.
We do. At least we're not going to fall off into the ocean.
Right. Not anytime soon. Maybe into the river.
You never know. I will tell you a quick story about trees. This had to do with Katrina, but it has to do with tornadoes. The company that owned the News Courier owned a paper in Laurel, Mississippi, you know, where the show Hometown is filmed.
Yes. That's
so popular with Ben and Aaron Napier. And they had a show where they'd had a tornado and had to rebuild. Well, when I went after Katrina, they're inland. Laurel is inland. Mm-hmm. But the reason I was there is they had 7 tornadoes spawned from Katrina hit Laurel.
Oh, wow.
And Laurel is known for its lumber. It's a lumber area. Uh-huh. And they had trees down on houses everywhere. I mean, the tornadoes did so much damage, and nobody thinks about it because it's inland.
Sure.
But it was, you know, that was
part of Katrina.
It was just crushed.
I know a lady that contract having her timber cut down and had the contract signed. And then the next day the tornado came in and tore up all the forest around that barn.
Wow.
She lost $50,000.
She couldn't say.
They were busted up.
Wow. Well, and we should tell the story about Donnie Powers from 74. A lot of folks around here will remember Donnie. He was the director of the Limestone County School Bus Garage for years and years. Great guy. And but he was dating his wife,
Felisa, and she was only 15 and he was 18, and they were riding in their car, which I think was a Corvette. And they had decided we're going to try to get home because they knew the tornado was coming, but it hit. Mm-hmm. And the car flipped. Well, I do remember the details that her ankle was nearly severed. Her foot was nearly severed at the ankle. Mm-hmm. But she didn't know, so she got up and walked, and they told her later that the mud had held her foot together.
Oh, wow.
She had walked around looking for Donnie. Uh-huh. Well, Donnie was elsewhere. He'd been thrown elsewhere, and when the people came through taking bodies and people away, they had him marked as dead, and they put him in and were going to take him to the morgue. But he was alive and she was alive, and they were so happy to have survived it that they got permission from her mother to marry early, and they got married very young, not long after the tornadoes, and stayed married his whole life.
That's right.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Absolutely. Tornadoes tend to bring people together as much as they tear things apart, don't they?
This is true. I had told the story in my book of the pastor, Reverend Ananias Green, and Tanner, who would put his family on the sofa when it was coming through. And it was him and his wife, and it was 2 or 3 sons, but they were all huddled on the sofa. And it found out later his wife had died. The sons were okay, but one had a splinter piece of wood that went through his brain.
Oh.
Wow.
And so he later died from that because they couldn't take it out.
Yeah.
So he lost his wife and son, and they were all right there together on the sofa, but he couldn't, there was nothing he could do.
Now, was he the one down at Lakeview Church?
I don't recall.
Lakeview down on Lucas Ferry got hit. And one thing to note is if you go out to check out that tornado memorial, the bricks that were used in the memorial, a lot of those came from Lakeview Church and other churches, businesses, and homes that had been destroyed in the 2011 tornadoes. You see there's a lot of variation in the bricks there, but it's from those homes that were lost.
And we had people come by the newspaper office and donate bricks that were from homes that were destroyed too for that memorial. So there are all kinds of different bricks in there.
That's right. Well, we could probably talk all day about tornadoes, but if you all want to know more about it, you can come to the library or the archives and check out April 3rd, 1974, A Night to Remember, about Alabama's tornadoes then, and that covers all of Alabama. You can get A History of Alabama's Deadliest Tornadoes by Kelly Kazek.
And that covers 1908 to 1998. I like to tell people because it's not the modern.
Right.
Yeah, you can see it at the archives, I think.
Yes,
right,
but it's also available, on Amazon?
It's available on Amazon, Books A Million, Barnes & Noble.
Yes.
You go to the local regional section.
And then is Day of Terror available anywhere?
I think that it was such a limited run.
Sure, but at the library and at the archives, you can also take a look at Day of Terror, 7 on 4/27, that Kelly and the News Courier crew put together after the 2011 tornadoes. We also have photos from the 74 tornadoes at the Limestone County Archives as well. So there's a lot of research that you can do, and you can learn more. And most importantly, stay safe.
Yes, please.
Don't take tornadoes for granted.
Please do not. They are deadly.
Absolutely.
Amen.
You got anything else to add, Richard?
No, sir. That's great.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us for this episode of Homegrown History. Kelly, we appreciate you very much for taking your very valuable and precious time to talk to us.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We'll have to have you come back and talk some more about some other topics. I know you've written quite a bit about Limestone County history and quirky things around the state, so we'll just have to bring you back another day. How about that?
That sounds good.
All right. Thank you. We'll see you next time for another episode of Homegrown History.
You've been listening to Homegrown History, presented by the Athens-Limestone County Public Library and the Limestone County Archives in Athens, Alabama. For more information, please visit the archive website at limestonearchives.com. And to hear other recordings from our Library Voices podcast series, check out our website at alcpl.org. Library Voices is also available on Spotify and Apple Podcasts.